Hi, this is Anindita Bhadra. I'm a behavioral biologist studying free-ranging dogs at the Indian Institute of Science Education and Research, Kolkata. Here are some glimpses of our very beautiful campus near the city of Kolkata in the eastern part of India. And here we have the dog lab, comprising of my PhD and master's thesis students present and past. And of course, we always have a large number of interns who are doing projects and training with us. So they are the actual force behind all the work that I'm going to talk to you about today. So, why do we study free ranging dogs? This is a question that a lot of people ask us, especially in India, where free ranging dogs are a common. We all know that dogs have evolved from gray wolves or wolf-like ancestors, but what majority of people are not aware of is that most of the dogs in the world are really in the free-ranging populations, and these dogs provide us with an ideal model system to study how dogs lived around us before we made them our pets and started playing around with their genetics. Free-ranging dog populations are spread out all over the global south and in some countries like in Italy and in Russia in some parts. When we look at dogs in urban spaces, which is what my lab studies most of the time, we find that they are present in all kinds of human habitats, from the sea beaches to the tops of mountains in human townships and villages. They are primarily scavengers, though they can hunt, because we have reports of dogs forming large packs and hunting down wild animals from time to time. They are largely dependent on humans for food, resources, shelter. They live in small to medium sized groups of three, four, five, six dogs. Sometimes they, of course, form larger groups like 10 or 12 dogs, but they don't remain stable in the urban spaces for a long time. They have both positive and negative interactions with humans. And in India, they are called by all kinds of names like strays, streeties, ferals, but of course, we will stick to the free ranging dogs in this presentation. A pup growing up on the streets of India faces complex interactions with its mother, with siblings, with other adults in the group, and this is all that I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. And then with humans, there is a love hate relationship. Humans are a source of food. Sometimes people actively go out to feed dogs. Humans also provide them shelter and a lot of love, but then there are a lot of people who hate dogs, and we even have cases where large number of dogs, especially pups, are killed by poisoning every year. Of course, we have to remember that India has a huge burden of rabies, and dogs are a major source of rabies, so there is enough cause for dog human conflict. In India, dogs have lived around humans in free ranging populations for many, many years. And this image here shows a glimpse of a story from the Indian epic Mahabharata, where a stray dog followed the Pandavas, the protagonists of the story, up to heaven in the Himalayas. So they are an interesting model system. They are around us. They have been in such free populations in similar habitats for a long, long time. They have undergone all the experiences of urbanization and have survived, and they are good for understanding behavioral ecology of the species, and for reducing dog-human conflict. We need such information. And of course, in India, as in many countries of the global south, we have the advantage of having these populations right around us. All we need to do is step out of the lab, and we have our model system right in front. We can put our work also in the perspective of the sustainable development goals, be it good health and well-being. There's a lot of focus on one health approach to research in fighting rabies, sustainable cities and communities, and of course, life on land. At the dog lab, we try to understand how dogs interact with each other in terms of mating, parental care, sibling interactions, territorial interactions, and competition over food space and mates. We try to understand how dogs interact with humans, looking at humans as resources as well as threats. And we also do cognitive studies to understand how smart dogs are. We give them physical cognitive tasks to solve. We try to understand their abilities to distinguish quantities, and we look at their food preferences. Some of these studies, especially in the context of dog human interactions and dog dog interactions, are what I'm going to talk to you about today. In doing this, we are addressing the big picture, which is the question of how did dogs become man's best friend. So let's begin with a glimpse at how a dog on the street spends its day. This study was carried out by Dr. Ornita Banerjee. She looked at time activity budgets of dogs over 24 hours of the day and over a span of a year, sampling randomly sighted dogs in different parts of West Bengal, in and around the campus of ISA Kolkata. She had data on 5,669 random sightings of dog over a 1 year period. We had behaviors which were active or inactive. Inactive behaviors were typically resting behaviors, and active behaviors were further divided into self and interactive and subdivided into different kinds of categories. We used this data to calculate the time activity budgets, and what we found is that dogs were active when the humans were. They were neither completely nocturnal nor completely diurnal. Their maximum period of activity was between 9 a.m. and 11 p.m., which pretty much coincides with the majority of the human activity time on the street. When we looked at the dog's overall life in terms of its birth and death, we found that in the population, the number of pups peak in December and January, which are the peak of the winter in this part of the world. This study comprised of data from 108 mother litter units covering 430 pups collected over a period of 5 years by my students Manubi and Srijuni. And after this peak, there was a sharp drop, which meant that not all the pups born in the population were, of course, surviving. So we looked at the causes of mortality and the rate of survival. What we found was 32% of the dogs die of natural causes like disease, cold, or injury from fights, whereas 32% are directly killed by humans and 31% go missing from the population, which is typically when people, especially kids, pick up pups, take them home, and then abandon them midway during their development. So, together, the mortality was the highest in the fourth month of pup age, which is 34% in 1 month. And this is also when, as I'll show you later, the young dogs become more and more independent of their mothers and maternal care stops. So this is the time when they face the highest mortality, and the lowest mortality is actually in the first 1 month when they are completely under the care of the mothers. Together, humans influence or induce 63% of dog mortality, while the total survival is only 19% up to 7 months or up to sexual maturity. So we try to understand how much mothers are responsible for giving care to the pups. When we look at pet dogs, we breed them, we give birth to the dogs in under very controlled condition. We take care of them, we give them vaccines. So humans are the ones who are responsible for taking care of the puppies more than the mothers, and they're actually separated from the mothers much early on. But when you look at free ranging dogs, it is completely the mother's responsibility to ensure their survival in the natural environment. So we look at maternal care pre birth in terms of locating ideal dens for giving birth, and post birth in terms of actually caring for the pup. This study was led by Srijani, who studied 148 sites in which pups have been born. She measured these dens, looked at other parameters like resources near the den, human disturbance near the den, the size of the den, and so on. She recorded the date of birth and the litter size which was born in the den. And when we looked at this data, we found that dens could be everywhere, more or less around human habitations. We found that the dens were sites like garbage dumps, even a cotton, or somebody's backyard, or here in this case, an abandoned sofa set. If you look at the data, here the den score, which is what we gave the score based on the qualitative parameters converted to a quantitative score, increases in this direction, and the litter size increases in this direction. And you have the number of dens with these two parameters together. What we finally see is very small dens are not really preferred by the mother, which is here, but medium to large size dens are preferred. And if you look at the combination of the den scores, which is den size as well as the resources, then together they are the two major components that contribute to the choice of a den. We also found that mothers were not avoiding humans like all other urban animals, but were actually preferring begging from humans for food than scavenging, leaving their pups behind in the den alone. Now we asked, are the mothers actually putting in any effort in finding the den, or is this a random distribution that we are looking at? So is the den choice a random choice, or is it actually selection? So what Srijuni did was she followed a number of pregnant females, and 20 of these we could track for a period of 1 month before they gave birth. We recorded the parameters of every site in which they were resting for long or digging to give birth, so denning behavior, and we found that there were 2 to 6 intermediate dens before the first one and the final one in which they gave birth. And when we looked at the den scores, we found that the final dens had much higher scores by our parameters as compared to the initial den or the first den and the average of all the intermediate dens. So as the time went by and the mothers rejected the dens, she went to better and better dens. So obviously the mother was actively selecting dens and not just giving birth in any available space randomly. So this was indeed parental care because she was investing in. Now, of course, after the pups are born, the mother has to actively take care of them, groom them, lick them, protect them, and of course, nurse them. Manu followed 22 such mother litter units between the third week of pup age to 17th week of pup age, collected nearly 1500 hours of observations, and this is only the data which we could use. Of course, for getting this data, we had to start with a much larger population because a lot of pups died, mothers died, and we had to abandon some of these groups. This was again a 5-year long study. What we found was if you looked at litter size versus the age of pups versus the proportion of active care that a pup received, then pups in smaller litters and earlier on in their developmental stage received the maximum care, which means that if you look at the mother, she was not scaling up her care with an increase in litter size constantly. And if you looked at the pups, for a pup, it was better if it had less number of siblings because it would then receive more maternal care. We looked at active care versus passive care. Active care would be behaviors which are energy intensive, like nursing, grooming, regurgitating food, playing, etc. Whereas passive care would be lying with the pups, curling up with them and keeping them warm, protecting them by just hanging around with them, allowing them to forage together with her, etc. And when we looked at the two kinds of care and how the mother apportions her time in these two kinds of care, we find that active care, marked in red here, decreases as the pups grow older and passive care increases if you looked at the total proportion, total care that the mother provides. We looked at types of care behavior individually, and if you see here, the pink marks suckling or nursing, maroon marks allo grooming, the gray marks sleeping in a pile, and so on and so forth. And if you see the distribution overall, then the mother is not spending equal amounts of time in all behaviors, and she is not spending the same kind of time in the different behaviors as the pups are growing older. So as the pups grew older, her investment in different kinds of behaviors kept on getting adjusted, and that is how the mother was conserving energy and changing her nature of giving care. We looked at nursing behavior much more closely because this is the most important of the maternal care behaviors for a mammal. We found that the mothers can invest 18% of their time in third week of the pup age in nursing, and this time spent in nursing decreases and stops in the 14th week. We wanted to check for weaning conflict as suggested by Travers in parent-offspring conflict theory. So we looked at what proportion of each nursing or suckling bout was initiated by the mother and initiated by the pups. So in the initial stages of development, there was equal interest between the mothers and the pups in initiating a bout. The mothers are marked in open circles and the pups are marked by red triangles. Once you reach the 8th week of pup age, you see that most of the bouts are initiated by the pups and almost no bouts are initiated by the mothers. And this is what weaning conflict is all about, that the interest of the mother to provide care should reduce and stop when the weaning conflict will start. We also looked at the duration of each bout of nursing or suckling, and we found that in the initial stages, the mothers were spending a lot more time, and the both the mother initiated and the pup initiated bouts were initially of the same similar durations, where actually mother initiated bouts were most often longer duration than the pup initiated bouts. But later, the bouts themselves became much shorter, which meant that the mothers were not initiating bouts and they were terminating the suckling bouts initiated by the pups much earlier than they would in the early stages of pup development. And this again matched the same window that we had identified. So we said that the 8 to 13 week of pup age marked the weaning period in dogs. So if you looked at the total timeline of maternal care, then up to 7 weeks, there is high level of active maternal care. 8 to 13 week marks the parent-offspring conflict zone, and beyond 13th week up to 16 weeks, there is mostly passive maternal care. Beyond 16 weeks, the juveniles become more or less independent of the mother and are on their own. Interestingly, when we were looking at parental care behavior, Manavi reported that there are other adults in the group who sometimes show care to the pups, and we were very curious about what exactly is happening. When we looked at this carefully, we found there were 19 mother litter units in these 15 groups, where 5 received only maternal care, 3 received male allocare or care by an adult male in addition to maternal care, 3 received care by another adult female in addition to maternal care, and 10 received all of these 3 kinds of care. There was one outlier in which the mother died a day after she gave birth. The grandmother, the mother's mother, adopted the pups, started nursing, and had a miscarriage herself and pretended to be the mother of these pups. So when we looked at the kinds of care given by the male, this could include resting with the pups, playing with them, guarding them. In this case, this is a male, and these are 2 females in the same family group. When we tried to look at the distribution of time that the fathers gave, we call them putative fathers because we did not know whether they were the real fathers. All we knew were that these males had mated with these females, and of course dogs are promiscuously breeding, so both males and females mate multiply, so the identity of the father was not known. Similar to the mothers, we created the data, we plotted the data for the fathers, and we saw that the fathers were now distributing their times over different kinds of behaviors. And if we looked at the summary, then while mothers were spending more time in feeding related behaviors, fathers were playing more. When we looked at female allocare, we found that female allocare behavior was distributed on the overall time of development, but was at a much lower level than that of the maternal care behaviors. Now, we were very curious because we found that the females were also sometimes seen to be nursing the pups. Now, nursing is the most expensive maternal care behavior. So, why on earth are allo mothers nursing non-filial pups? Because it does not make any sense biologically. So, we looked at allo nursing more carefully. 594 allosuckling bouts across 11 litters were analyzed carefully for proportion of suckling initiated by the allo mothers, and we found you see them all sitting on the 0 line. So allo mothers never initiated suckling. The pups were initiating suckling, and in fact, the allo mothers always terminated these suckling bouts at a very short notice, very soon after the pups initiated them. They were not really volunteering to nurse the non-filial pups. So basically, the allo mothers were victims of milk theft. Milk theft is reported routinely in herd-living herbivores, but has never before been reported in carnivorous species. So if I look at the life of pup, it has increased chances of survival because of caring mothers, helping aunts, sisters, grandmothers, because all of these allo mothers are maternal relatives, and attentive putative fathers. But at the end of it, only 1 in 5 pups survive until adulthood. And a major reason of this, as I've already told you before, are us. So we try to understand how well dogs understand us without any training, without being pets, with just their experience of living around humans. How good are they at judging us? We did a series of experiments looking at humans as source of food because dogs actively beg, as you see here in this image, and human feeders play an important role in their lives. And Debottom, Dr. Debottom Bhattacharya did all of this work for his thesis. The first set of experiments were aimed at understanding how well dogs follow pointing gestures. So we adopted methodologies in pet dogs where we had the test setup and the control setup with no pointing. In the test setup, there were two covered bowls. One had a piece of chicken, the other was sham baited by rubbing chicken in it. So both smelled of chicken, and Debuttom pointed blindly because he did not know which of these had chicken. And we did these experiments with 68 pups, 83 adults, and 53 juveniles. And what we found is that pups readily follow pointing, and juveniles and adults are not so good at following the human pointing gesture. Adults were the only ones in this group who showed both positive and negative reinforcement. We did 3 trials with every individual. We found that when a dog followed pointing, found a reward, it had a higher probability of following the next point. If it followed pointing, did not find a reward, that was negative reinforcement. And only adults showed this. So they were judging humans by their immediate interaction with the stranger who had shown this pointing gesture. We also tested them for ability of following complex pointing like the momentary pointing and the dynamic distal pointing, and this we did only with adults, 60 each, and we found that in both cases the dogs were following pointing more than they did for the dynamic proximal cues. Now we think that this is because dogs are used to having food being thrown at them. They don't have people bending down low and feeding them from a bowl, so they might be more wary of approaching when we are bending low, but are very good at judging the point even when it is shown to them momentarily. We did another set of experiments where we showed them typical postures which humans use in their day-to-day interactions with dogs. One is a friendly gesture of bending slightly and calling out to them with both hands, low impact threat of just raising a hand, and a high impact threat of raising a hand with a short stick. And after each of these, we gave them food and tried to see their response to food. So what we found is that, summing up this complex looking graph, that dogs respond more when you give them the food, but when you give them the high impact threatening cue, they don't respond even when you give them food. But with the low impact threatening cue, though the response is lower than the friendly gesture, they still respond more than in the case of the high impact threatening cue. So the dogs are quite good at differentiating between these social cues, again without any training, and they are able to respond accordingly. We did this experiment with two sets of dogs, one on a short term basis and one on a long term basis, to understand how dogs build trust. Is it food or is it love, but based on which dogs would interact? I think you can hear some of the dogs barking behind me right outside my house here. So that tells you how close they are in India here. So, anyway, coming back to the experiment, here is a piece of chicken on the road, and here is a piece of chicken in Shubra's hand. And a solitary dog is offered this, and the dog has the option of either feeding from the hand or feeding from the ground. And one set of dog is given an extra piece of chicken after they have made the choice. Another set of dogs are just petted on the head without the extra piece of chicken. What we found was, in the first trial, most dogs prefer to feed from the ground. Even in the second trial, irrespective of whether there is a social reward or there is a food reward, the chances of changing their option from the ground to the hand or hand to the ground are pretty low. So they stick to what they were doing in the first trial. Now we did the long-term experiments. 21 dogs in different localities were randomly chosen and given the food reward. So you go, you do the experiment of offering the food, and irrespective of their choice, you give them an extra piece of chicken. Go back the next day and repeat this. And we found that most dogs stuck to whatever they were doing on day 1, even on day 15. When we did a similar experiment with 22 dogs, where instead of extra food they were given petting, then on day 1 there were 7 dogs which fed from the hand. At the end of the experiment on day 15, there were 15 dogs out of 22 which were now feeding from our hands. Now, of course, this suggests that the social reward condition was more beneficial for use if you wanted to befriend a dog. Devatam did another experiment where he tested dogs on day 1 for following of the pointing gesture. Next 3 days, control condition, the dogs were given food. Test condition, dogs were given only social reward, that is petting on the head. Day 5, you test them again for the point following experiment, and this time you point to the wrong bowl on purpose. What we found is that the test dogs showed a much higher level of point following, and they did not show negative reinforcement. Even when you sent them to the wrong bowl, they followed your pointing once again. So with just 3 days of befriending a dog, they can become quite tame, which is very interesting because these dogs had not known the experimenter before the experiment. In another set of population level experiments, we've been trying to understand how humans impact the lives of dogs. So we went to different areas with different levels of human density or flux. So very crowded areas, intermediately crowded areas, and areas with very low flux. So this is the data which shows the flux is high, intermediate, or low. And we looked at the approachability of dogs, and we found that in high and intermediate flux zones, the dogs were much more approachable than in the zones where they actually encounter very few strangers. So after we did this, we also looked at the demeanors of dogs, and we found that the dogs in the low human flux zones were the most anxious and least friendly to strangers. But we hardly saw any aggression in our experiments. We did this one study, which is one of my favorites. In Bengal, in our part of the country, we have this huge festival called Durga Puja, when there are thousands of people thronging the roads to visit what are called pandals, where all of these festivals happen. And there are thousands of food stalls set up. There's a large amount of food out there on the streets. So our question was, what are the dogs going to do when there is a sudden surge in human footfall in their normal habitat, and there's also a huge surge in resources? Are they going to be lured by the resources? Are they going to be put off by the huge crowd of people? So we did a study where we sampled the area for dogs 1 month before the event, because we know where the events are going to happen. We sampled them during the Durga Puja and 1 month after the event. And we found that yes, flux does increase during the event, and then dog abundance actually decreases during the event. So what are the dogs doing? The dogs during the event are becoming more vigilant, and they are more scattered, not resting so much in groups anymore as they tend to do in the pre-event and the post-event, and the pre and post-event conditions were comparable to each other. So ample food was not enough to lure them, they were actually avoiding the crowd. So I will sum up the findings which I have reported up to now. Free-ranging dogs have very active and complex social lives, so they are not really poor, homeless dogs as we tend to think they are. Humans are a threat to their survival, but we are also a major source of their food and, as I showed you, shelter. They have complex interactions with humans and are good at understanding our social gestures. Lifetime experience with humans is likely to shape the personalities of free-ranging dogs, and that is the study that we are doing currently. I will stop here, thanking the Brazilian Annual Ethology Meeting organizers for inviting us to do the symposium, and for the symposium organizers for this opportunity to come and talk to you about our work in India. Of course, the funders who have been supporting our work for the last 12 years, ISER Kolkata for all the logistics support, and the Behavior Ecology Laboratory Group for being a very vibrant group on campus, which sustains us emotionally as well as intellectually. And of course, a big thank you for the dogs, to the dogs for being such wonderful model systems. Thank you.